I have a microphone. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to the organizers, first of all, of course, for having me and for giving me this opportunity to present in this extraordinary circumstances for me, I have to admit. And I also have to admit, as you heard, I'm not a chemist. I'm not a food safety expert, and I'm not a risk assessment person. I'm a philosopher of science, so I won't be able to tell you anything above and beyond about the TTC in particular, above and beyond the things you already know and you know much better than I do. But what I can do and what I will do is take a rather broad and general perspective on the issue of uncertainty and the implications that uncertainty might have on decision making. So here we go. This is a quote from an opinion piece of the three European scientific committees, and I found this passage in there, and I'll just read it to you. The authors there say, all risk assessment approaches have some degree of uncertainty. When the TTC approach is applied, it is important for both risk assessors and risk managers to keep in mind that it is a probability-based screening tool and may have additional uncertainty. So this passage can be interpreted as saying that there are at least two kinds of uncertainties. Yes, one is, I added a few emphases here, one is risk that we try to assess in the approach with a, and it's said here, with a probability-based approach. So that's what the TTC is all about. We try to assess risk. Then there is what the authors call here additional uncertainty. Unfortunately, they don't tell you too much about the nature of this additional uncertainty. However, the distinction between risk on the one hand and what they call additional uncertainty on the other reminded me of a classical distinction that we know in philosophy and actually also in particular in economics, because the distinction was introduced, as some of you might know, by Chicago economist Frank Knight as early as 1921 in an influential book entitled Risk, Uncertainty and Profit. And in there, Knight writes the following: uncertainty must be taken in a sense radically distinct from the familiar notion of risk, from which it has never been properly separated. The essential fact is that risk means in some cases a quantity susceptible of measurement, while at other times it is something distinctly not of this character. And there are far-reaching and crucial differences in the bearings of the phenomena depending on which of the two is really present and operating. It will appear that a measurable uncertainty, or risk proper, as we shall use the term, is so far different from an unmeasurable one that it is not in effect an uncertainty at all. So Knight makes a distinction between risk on the one hand, which is like what he says, a measurable or quantifiable kind of uncertainty, although according to Knight it's not an uncertainty at all, and an unmeasurable or a more qualitative kind of uncertainty. And this distinction has become really relevant and crucial in economics and in philosophy as well. So let's take a closer look at this distinction, and let's begin by risk, by looking at risk. So you can just simply ask, and if you ask yourself for a moment, what is risk actually? So a very general characterization of risk could be to say that it is any situation in which more than one outcome is possible and some outcomes are preferable to others. It's a very general characterization of a risk situation. Then risk is also quantifiable, as we just learned from Knight, by putting numbers on probabilities. It is measurable and therefore also manageable uncertainty, we could say. It requires perfect or at least robust knowledge. So in order to have a situation of risk, we need to know quite a lot about the world already. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. And very important, risk does not preclude rational choice. Yes? We can manage risk. We can act rationally under a situation of risk. Randomness is also not a problem. And this is also why actually gambling situations are paradigm cases for risky situation because we can rationally assess what will be rational betting odds for a certain gamble. So here's an example. If I would ask you to pick one of these two games, you were asked to like choose between these two options, either with probability 0.2 win 45 euros or otherwise nothing, or with probability 0.25 win 30 euros or otherwise nothing. You don't have to pay any money to enter the game, so you have 3 seconds to decide who would play game 1 if you would decide rationally, who would play game A, who would pick A, who would play B. Okay, 50-50, it's common. The rational choice, of course, would be to play A, because what you would do if you would act purely rationally would just calculate expected utility. You just multiply this number by this number, you get 9 euros and a little bit less in the case B. So A would be actually the perfectly rational choice. Of course, those of you who are completely broke at the moment might prefer to win some money at all, okay? And since the probability is higher to win 30 euros in the case B, you might rationally choose to play B, but this only holds if you add additional information to the situation. So here's another example. Think you have an injured knee. Then the options are also to operate the injured knee with a success rate of 65%, or do not operate the injured knee with a chance of spontaneous recovery of 30%. So who would operate? Who would not operate? Sorry? Well, of course, you're right. Of course, it's a very simplified situation. I agree. But we can take a closer look at this one. Okay, so what you have here, you have 2 options, do not operate or operate. Each option, each course of action is associated with 2 possible outcomes: spontaneous recovery, or that the injury persists in the case of not operating, or a successful or a failed operation in the case of operating. And each option is assigned a specific probability value, and each option is also associated with a consequence, and these consequences are evaluated according to the preferences of the decision maker. And it's clear in this case that the most preferable consequence would here be to end up with a normal knee without an operation. Okay? Whereas the worst case would definitely be to have a failed operation. And here again, we can calculate expected utilities if we would act purely rational, and then we would end up with a rational choice of having the operation. Okay, so this brings us to a little bit more formal definition of what actually a rational choice is. So a rational choice is based on the decision maker's current assets. Assets include not only money, but also physiological states, psychological capacities, social relationships, feelings, and so on. Then, very importantly, it is based on the possible consequences of the choice. Yes? It is when these consequences are not determined, their likelihood is evaluated according to the basic rules of probability theory. And fourth, it is, in order to make it a choice at all, you have to choose at the end. It is a choice that is adaptive within the constraints of those probabilities and the values of satisfaction associated with each of the possible consequences of the choice. That simply means at the end of it all, you just pick the most preferable option, or you maximize utility in general. So now, it's important to note that if one of these 4 criteria is not satisfied, we might actually end up with an irrational decision. Now, for our context, it's in particular the 3rd criterion that we should take a look on, because what I just said actually means that if we're unable, yes, to quantify options with probabilities, the outcomes, if we're unable to assign probabilities to our outcomes, we actually leave the framework of rational choice. So when outcomes are unknown, or when we're not able to put probabilities on the outcomes, strictly speaking, the rules of rational choice theory are not applicable. And in a situation like that, we are confronted with Knightian, unquantifiable, qualitative uncertainty. And then, of course, the question arises, how do we decide on the uncertainty, on the qualitative uncertainty? Now, Let me make a few remarks about what you could call the psychology of uncertainty. I think it's important to realize that we as humans, we have a tendency to deny uncertainty. Yes? We are pattern-seeking animals. We don't like uncertainty. We tend to apply causal thinking to processes that are genuinely random, or even to processes where the causal mechanism is, in principle, inscrutable. And this can be shown in psychological, empirical experiments. We also invest a lot to reduce uncertainty in daily life, in politics, and in science, of course. You could think of science even as a huge uncertainty-reducing enterprise. Because after all, what we try to do in science is like we try to gather knowledge about reality in order to make it predictable and manageable. We also tend to underestimate the role of chance in life, especially when we're successful. We tend to ascribe the success to our abilities and skills, and we try to underestimate the influence of luck or good fortune, which is very often present when we are successful. And in the economy, when people realize that there is a situation of Knightian uncertainty, this can lead to what economists call a destructive flight to quality behavior. That simply means that people start to clean out their portfolio of everything that doesn't have a high rating. So, or in shorter words, people start to panic. Okay? They don't like uncertainty. So uncertainty is hard to accept. It seems that we as humans, we are somehow hardwired in a way that we have a natural aversion, almost, against uncertain situations. So, and in science in particular, this tendency is expressed in the urge to transform uncertainty, and I'm still speaking about qualitative uncertainty, into risk, into quantitative uncertainty. That is, to use probability-based approaches even in cases where this might not be possible. And here is a case. Remember, in 2009, there was a swine flu outbreak in Mexico, and the situation was very confusing. There was not a lot of information. It was a new virus. People didn't know how it would spread. They didn't know too much about the mortality rates, and so on and so on. But nevertheless, decision makers, what they usually do in situations like this, they develop worst case scenarios, okay? And what this means, you guess probabilities, okay? And that's what they did. Here are the numbers for, I was in London at the time. I was spending 2 terms at the London School of Economics, so there were a lot of coughing students running around on the campus, so I got worried a little bit myself. This was the estimation of the British Department of Health in September 2009, so they actually calculated with a figure of 30% clinical cases. So 30% of the UK population would have been infected by the virus according to this scenario. They calculated with a mortality rate of 1 in 1,000. That would have meant roughly 20,000 deaths in the UK, which is a significant number, of course. What happened in fact, indeed 1 in 1,000 did die, so they got the mortality rate right, but only 0.7, around 0.7 reported clinical cases. So their worst case scenario was flawed significantly in this figure. And this is, of course, a good thing. Well, it's a good thing and a bad thing, okay? Because, of course, we actually know when we develop worst case scenarios that they are almost certainly wrong. And this is good. I mean, if the world would always behave in the worst case, this planet would be a rather unpleasant place to live on, okay? But it is not good in the sense that it might lead, and it actually did lead in the case of the swine flu case, to an increased skepticism against science, because people could come up with something like the following. They could say, well, they told us we're all going to die, and what happened? Nothing. Okay? So that was a situation when actually the quantification, the describing of probabilities, might have had unfavorable consequences. This is the better example. At the time, in 2009, an eminent Cambridge statistician, David Spiegelhalter, published a little article in the London Times. He was asked to assess the risk of getting swine flu in the UK, and his answer was quite frank. He said, I haven't a clue. Because as a good scientist and as a good statistician, he knew that he didn't have enough data to calculate the risk of getting swine flu. Okay, so this brings us back to the question then, how do we decide under uncertainty, under qualitative uncertainty? This is the bad news. As far as I'm aware, there is no generic best practice of how to deal with uncertainty. But there are valuable approaches in specific cases, as for instance Martin et al. Have shown in a 2007 paper where they qualitatively assessed the uncertainty in the context of EDCs. So qualitative uncertainty is very often highly context dependent. Yes? So you always have to look at a specific case and think about the qualitative uncertainties involved in a specific case. And it is also acknowledged that making explicit, T is missing here, the kinds and severity of the relevant qualitative uncertainties leads to better judgment. So thinking about qualitative uncertainty does help. Now, as I just said, making explicit the kinds of qualitative uncertainties involved does mean that we need something like a taxonomy of qualitative uncertainty. And this is a suggestion that has been recently made by two colleagues at the London School of Economics, Richard Bradley and Marie Drechsler. They distinguish three different kinds of uncertainties corresponding to the nature of the judgment to be made. There is, on the one hand, what they call modal uncertainty. So modal uncertainty is uncertainty about what could be the case. So it arises in the context of possibility judgments. Okay? In the most severe case of modal uncertainty, we are unaware of certain outcomes. Okay? So they are unconceived outcomes. That's a kind of modal uncertainty because it concerns something that is possible. Then there is also empirical uncertainty, and I heard a lot about, I think you guys are dealing a lot with what they would call empirical uncertainty, because empirical uncertainty is uncertainty about what is the case. So it arises in the context of factual judgments. And in a more severe case of empirical uncertainty, we are in a complete lack of knowledge about the certain domain of empirical reality. We simply don't know what's going on for a certain domain. That would be the most severe case of empirical knowledge, uncertainty. Then there is also, very importantly, what they call normative uncertainty. And normative uncertainty is uncertainty about what should be the case. It arises in the context of evaluative judgments. And in the most severe case of normative uncertainty, we face a moral dilemma. That's a situation where our ethical principles do not give us any guidance of in order to decide what will be the right course of action to take. Not the most favorable, not the preferable one, but the right in an ethical or moral sense. Now, can this be applied to the TTC approach? So I'm getting speculative now. So with respect to the TTC case, we could say that even if we admit that given that there is a high level of confidence in the quality of the toxicity databases, the exposure data, the appropriateness of extrapolations, then the TTC can and should be used as a reliable risk assessment tool. Okay? So even if this is the case, we can still ask whether there might be additional uncertainties, which would be Knightian, unquantifiable, qualitative uncertainties in the application of the TTC approach. Okay? And then we can use, again, the taxonomy, and we can categorize those uncertainties, those potential uncertainties. And of course, this list should be filled out by you, who are the expert, because I can only make suggestions. I know too little about it, but these are just possible examples. So in the case of modal uncertainty, we could ask, are there potential, what I call, maybe this is not right, non-toxicological effects, which would concern allergy, hypersensitivity, or intolerance, okay? Something potential that we should probably think about. With respect to empirical uncertainty, we could ask how robust is the structural similarity approach, chroma class approach in the first place, yes? Does it need revision? And as far as I understood, some of you would agree here. Okay, so that's an empirical kind of uncertainty. And then, as an example for normative uncertainty, we could ask something like, how should the application of the TTC approach be communicated to the public? And I really want to stress this is a normative issue. Okay, it's not it's a purely scientific question. It involves values, evaluative judgment. How do we deal with the approach? How do we communicate it to the public? And let me end by a serious joke. Let's engage in some speculative thinking. So imagine you go to your local supermarket, you grab a loaf of bread, and there is a label. In the near future, there might be a label on the bread saying something like the following. This bread contains unintentionally added and or degradation products of intentionally added chemicals at low concentration with unknown toxicity. But never mind, we have assessed the risk for your and your children's health using the probability-based TTC threshold of toxicological concern approach. There is a very high probability that you do not have to be concerned. Thanks for buying our TTC-approved bread. You could tell no one would buy that bread, probably. And of course, sarcasm is intended here, but I do not intend to make fun of the issue because I really believe that this is a serious question, a serious normative, a question that is related to a normative uncertainty that goes along with the application of the TTC approach, just as an example. And with this, I'll leave you and thank you for your attention.